Okay, welcome everyone. While people are joining us, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Layla Harris, and I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded and occupied territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what's known as Vancouver, BC. Our guest today is coming to us from quite far away, and the intention initially was for Mara Goldman to be a Peter Wall International Visiting Fellow with us, but that's been delayed several times over. So we decided to go ahead with the talk to start some engagement with our students and faculty here at UBC, which was the hope and purpose of the visit. So Mara Goldman has a background both in conservation biology and also in geography. Her PhD is from the Department of Geography at UW-Madison. She is currently associate professor in the Department of Geography at Colorado Boulder. And she has two books to her credit. The first one that I'll mention will be a subject of our discussion and talk today. So in 2020, Narrating Nature was released, Wildlife Conservation and Maasai Ways of Knowing with University of Arizona Press. And prior to that, she'd worked on a special issue, edited volume with Nadashti and Turner, well known in many of our circles, on Knowing Nature, Conversations at the Intersection of Political Ecology and Science and Technology Studies. So as those two topics and titles sort of encapsulate, a lot of Mara's work is sort of thinking through the intersection between conservation spaces, STS, and political ecology approaches. She also does that sometimes with an orientation and inflection from gender and feminist approaches to those issues. And she's investigated a number of issues, especially in East African contexts, around community-based conservation, tenure security, livelihoods, and so forth. You can look at her work to find more about wildebeest mapping and also wildlife corridors in East Africa and other topics of the sort. So without any more, Mara, thanks for joining us, even though it's late for you, and we look forward to learning more about your recent work and the themes of decolonizing conservation. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Layla, and thanks to all of you for coming. Especially as we're on Zoom, and like Layla said, this has sort of been a ongoing process of having my travels be interrupted time and again by COVID, and so we decided to move ahead with this, and hopefully we will be able to do something in person soon. So thanks, Layla, for organizing it, for IRES for hosting it, and also thanks to PWIS, the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, for hosting me, for being a visiting scholar, and for their patience for having me try and figure out how to actually visit Canada, which will hopefully happen at some point this semester. I would also normally start with a land recognition, but I'm actually not talking to you from Colorado. As Layla mentioned, it's quite late for me right now. It's 9:30 at night because I'm speaking to you from Portugal, which of course has an entirely different perspective, or presents itself with a very different perspective on colonization, being in the heart of it all, where it all began. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about today, but I do want to raise that because I think it's important as we start to sort of work through what it means to decolonize conservation, to think about how those conversations need to be had or are going to be had within the EU in the former colonizing countries, particularly as it stands, the EU stands to try and make have a really large role to play in the current putting together of the plans for the biodiversity protection for the next couple decades. So as the title suggests, I am today, I'm sort of bridging a discussion of my book, which is up here on the slides, Narrating Nature, Wildlife Conservation and Maasai Ways of Knowing, that was published last year by the University of Arizona Press. And because of COVID, I haven't really done many book talks because I'm not a big fan of the Zoom method, but here we are. But I'm going to be bridging that with a discussion of sort of a larger conversation that I was supposed to be in Canada to have with all of you. And that was supported by the Institute to ask larger questions about what it really means to talk about and decolonize conservation or indigenize conservation. And to think about this globally in two senses of the word. One, from sort of a global agenda setting as we think about the biodiversity conservation COP15 coming up, but also globally in a disaggregate sense, to think about the experiences that are happening and the processes that are unfolding around the world in different places with different ecologies and cultures and histories, but oftentimes very similar kind of top-down colonial conservation models, right? And to speak across some of these different experiences, to think across theory and practice across several disciplines within the natural and social sciences, and then to think about how the work that I have done and that I'm engaged in now can contribute to this larger conversation, particularly right now, as I think there's a general agreement across multiple disciplines, natural and social sciences, that conservation is in desperate need for an overhaul, right? And that it's failed to meet biodiversity conservation goals. And I would say that in sort of thinking about doing that overhaul, we really need to take seriously doing conservation differently. So decolonizing it, if you will. So I'm going to start by going over my book. And then I'm going to sort of spend some time as much as I can within the time that I'm allowed, and then loop back to connect the points that I make in the book to these larger questions. So I try to do a lot in the book, and more than I'm going to be able to explain today. But I think that my major goals can really be kind of narrowed down to two large, overarching and overlapping goals. One of them is to really challenge the approach of mainstream conservation, colonial conservation, if you will, and explore other ways of being with, knowing, and managing what we've come to call nature. So I put it in scare quotes. And then the other is to work with different narrative formats and storytelling practices to really interrogate boundaries of many kinds. The big one being that between nature and society, wild and domestic, and then science and all other ways of knowing and being in the world. And I also, of course, want to do more than just make a theoretical contribution, but I want the work to actually do some work to contribute to ongoing struggles on the ground, where Maasai face ongoing dispossessions in the name of conservation. And actually right now, as I speak, Maasai in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area are once again being threatened by eviction in the name of conservation by the Tanzanian state, but of course, backed up by UNESCO and the IUCN. And the Tanzanian government is also working to seize land right outside of Serengeti that is legally registered as Maasai village land. And all of this is done in the name of conservation. And so during this process, Maasai are just asking to be heard, to really play an active role in conversations, which is not happening. And saying all along that they haven't done anything wrong, they've actually protected the wildlife. And so why is this continuing to happen, right? And so this is an ongoing process and one that I think continues to need to be worked on. All right, so the book draws from over 2 decades of work across Maasai occupied areas in northern Tanzania and southern Kenya. And so this is a map from ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, who I worked with on a postdoc in some of these locations outlined in yellow. The red outline here is an area that's referred to as Maasai land, historically occupied and managed by Maasai. And these areas in yellow are world-renowned national parks, Serengeti National Park, Amboseli, Masai Mara, and the land surrounding the parks, which are occupied by lots of different people, but predominantly Maasai, which are the communities that I've been working with. They all share a history of land loss and ongoing politics of resource use and control politics. All right, all of these places share sort of a really strong focus by mainstream colonial conservation over many decades, a lot of resources, financial and otherwise, to transform landscapes and livelihoods. I also think, though, that there remain possibilities across these landscapes for doing things differently. And it's those possibilities that I explore in the book. Starting with looking at the various forms of border crossings that occur across areas that are deemed natural, as in protected areas. And so here we have a picture of wildlife, wildebeest and zebra, grazing in the Simanjiro Plains, which is village land, Maasai village land. And it's actually an area that's been deemed incredibly important for wildebeest in particular during their calving time by ecologists, because the pasture is particularly high in nutrients. It's higher in nutrient value than the pasture inside Tarangire National Park. And this is in part just an ecological and historical relic that the park boundaries were drawn around the only permanent water source, the Tarangire River, and that areas that have more ephemeral water sources tend to have higher nutrient content in the soil and in the pastures. We can also think about it, though, as possibly related to land use. So there was a theory put forth quite a while ago about the production of grazing lawns by wildlife inside Serengeti National Park, suggesting that the grazing by wildlife, in fact, through nutrient cycling, create these sort of nutrient hotspots of pasture. And some say that this can also happen through grazing by livestock. So the grazing by livestock can actually be creating places that are more inviting for certain wildlife. And this has been shown by research, again, by ILRI in Kenya, outside of Masai Mara Game Reserve. And here you can see some small stock being grazed by a young Maasai woman. And in the background, there's wildebeest and then a Maasai home. And then again here, outside Amboseli National Park. And then back in Tanzania, outside of, on the other side of Tarangire National Park, in the area in between Tarangire and Lake Manyara National Park. And this is an area that Maasai actually refer to as the Plains of the Lions, because it's always populated by zebra and therefore lions. And this is an area that's also been deemed really important by conservationists as a corridor for wildlife to move back and forth between the parks. And so there's been various attempts to parcel out new protected spaces within this area. One of them being a successful in the sense of succeeding at creating a protected area, which is the Manyara Ranch, a community-based conservation area that I've written quite a bit about, and I'm happy to talk about in depth. For now, all that's needed to know is that it occupies a patch of land that conservationists wanted to protect as a part of the wildlife corridor between the two parks. Maasai are allowed to graze in the ranch, but only on very regulated schedule by permission. And so this is actually a picture of a boundary transgression in the other direction, of Maasai actually grazing inside the park illegally. They refer to it themselves as stealing pastures. And unfortunately, these sorts of boundary transgressions are not looked upon as favorably by conservationists as the others. And they're often met with fines, beatings, sometimes imprisonment. Yet Maasai continue to do it, oftentimes to access pasture that is more available inside the parks or protected spaces like this, particularly at times of drought when all the other pastures have been depleted. And they often do so with cash in hand so that they can pay off the guards. I'm interested in exploring in depth, ecologically, politically, socially, culturally, what happens in these in-between spaces that are deemed social, but that are full of wildlife. And how do Maasai know about these spaces and how do they feel about them as the dominant occupants in the areas that I worked? And so the specific places that I looked at in depth ecologically was in this area referred to as the Tarangire Manyara ecosystem, that's sort of seen as the larger ecosystem connecting those two parks, Tarangire and Lake Manyara. And this is a map that I created when I was in the field. This is my Manyara Ranch. This is the tip of Tarangire National Park, and this is the tip of Lake Manyara National Park, and this is the two villages where I worked. What the map does is, though, it represents Maasai spatial organization, or Maasai spatial knowledge. And so I mapped out Maasai place names, which all refer to, some of them refer to ecological, to soil types, to vegetation types, some to wildlife movements, like the Plains of the Lions or the Crossings of the Lions, some to historical land use. And I figured out that it was important for me to be able to utilize Maasai to draw on or start with Maasai spatial organizations to talk to Maasai about their use of the space. And so this enabled conversations with Maasai about how they use the space and how wildlife use the space without adding yet another layer of translation. And then I used this map as a base map to then to put in ecological transects. And so together with Maasai, we decided where it was important to put transects to count wildlife presence in village land. And so the transects were not random, but they were selected by Maasai to be in areas that are important for Maasai for grazing, but also for wildlife, and that represented different kinds of vegetation zones. So short grass plains, montane lands, low-lying lands, and so on. And these lines are the transects. They all had Maasai names based on the vegetation zone. And there are 8 of them total, 2 of them going from village land into Manyara Ranch. The transects were walked by myself and 2 Maasai men for once a month for every other month for 1 year, and then once a month for 2 additional years, but without my presence. And then we use these maps to map out the data. We also, though, mapped other ways of knowing wildlife that don't necessarily show up in ecological transects, which are, of course, only sort of one sample frame at one particular point in time. And so we called these opportunistic sightings of wildlife at other times that we were able to put on the map as well. And then the different color codings on the map illustrate qualitative data that shows what areas are important at what times of the year for Maasai. So it was different ways to bring together different kinds of information. In creating these maps and in discussing wildlife movements, I utilized Maasai seasonal breakdowns. And so this is Maasai temporal knowledge, if you will. I found their seasons, which are 5, to be much more useful in talking about wildlife and livestock movements and use of the space, because they had a much finer level of, a much finer scale, if you will, of seasonality than the typical maps that you get from wildlife conservation organizations, or even land use planning maps that are basically wet season and dry season. So the Maasai seasons were 5, and I talk about that in depth as well in the book. All right, but now there was, in addition to the maps and to visually sort of explaining or showing Maasai use of the landscape, I was also interested in finding a way to express the knowledge that I was learning, the information I was gathering in all its complexity, as well as in a way that was more reflexive of and responsible to Maasai ways of knowing and of talking about wildlife and about knowledge, right? And so I spent some time trying to think about what a more appropriate mechanism would be than the sort of standard academic text that I'm used to using and writing. And after spending much of my time in Maasai in meetings when I was in the field, I'm sure many of you have experienced this. You're in the field and you're supposed to be doing interviews or transects, and then everything's called off because there's a meeting. And so I started to go to the meetings. And I decided that the meeting, or the Ingigwana in Ma, would be a really useful framework. So a little bit about the Ingigwana. Ingigwana is a Maasai word, and it refers to a meeting, a discussion, a consultation, a debate. And Maasai spent a lot of time in meetings. The Ingigwana illustrates the strength for Maasai of the spoken word, the importance of nonlinear debate and discussion, and the value of both divergence or diversity and unity within Maasai society. It's a central component of Maasai governance, leadership, knowledge production, and management systems. And there were meetings, as I said, all the time, all different kinds of meetings, age set meetings. And when I was there was this huge age set ceremony that was about to happen. So there were a lot of age set meetings that were being called by the traditional leaders. And I had time to go and sit in and observe those meetings, political meetings, clan meetings, village government meetings, and then of course, meetings held by outsiders, outside NGOs, sometimes Maasai ones even, conservation NGOs, and then the Manure Ranch. And I started to pay attention not only to what was said at these meetings, but how things were said. And I realized that at the meetings that were held by outsiders, even Maasai NGOs, they were held in a way that was easy for me to recognize and to be familiar with. You had somebody at the front and people sort of looking at that person, and then them usually having a whole list of agenda items, and then in presenting the agenda items, sort of saying a list of choices from which they want to get some feedback on. And while this was comfortable for me, I found many of my Maasai friends and colleagues were not comfortable, and that they really didn't participate very much in these meetings. And it was very different than the Maasai meetings that I observed that were led by Maasai, which seemed to be, on the other hand, just much more open, circular, and dialogic. And so I came to learn that there were what I break down as 3 primary principles underlining the Ingigwana that I think enable this sort of openness. The first one is that the agenda item is usually just one, because there's not enough time to do more than one, and it's open. It's just an open item for discussion. Let's talk about this in school, not should we build a school in point A or point B. Just let's talk about this topic. There's no sort of predetermined list of options. Second, all in theory have the freedom to speak and to be listened to. There are no rules constraining anybody's contribution, which means that a meeting can take all day, much gets repeated, and the conversation may go in completely unexpected directions because somebody can stand up and say something that seems completely unrelated to the topic at hand, but eventually it might, in fact, come back to what was being discussed. And lastly, a meeting is finished when and only when a consensus is reached. And if a consensus is not reached, then the meeting is put off until there is one that is reached, and it could take 2 to 3 days for that to happen. The consensus is a complex undertaking, and it's not a majority rules, it's not a voting. There are sort of complex power relations and negotiations at play. But in the end, the consensus does, I believe, encapsulate the multiplicity of views, knowledge, and opinions that are voiced at the meeting by those that are present, right? And this is illustrated by the fact that the consensus is often discussed and remembered as not the sort of just singular whole, but as sort of the leading, everything that led up to it as well. So people will say, we decided on X, but before we got there, we talked about this, and so talked about this, and so talked about this. And basically the consensus is when there's nothing left to say and people agree that it's a good place to end, right? And so it should really be, rather than thinking of it as a singular, cohesive, like complete Maasai worldview or presentation, it's more about a piecing together of the multiple contributions from different individual Maasai of different gender, class, age, wealth, clan, and positioning within society, with different knowledge, experience, and status, right? And so in this way, I decided that the Ingagwana would be a really good thing, or sort of model, if you will, to use as a theoretical framework, a narrative device, and a methodological tool of diffraction. And here I'm drawing from Karen Barad and Donna Haraway to talk about diffraction of multiple perspectives and knowledges to basically build the kind of power charge conversations that Haraway argues is the future for a responsible science. What it also does for me is it helps me to not put up one sort of assumed truth, which is, we can think about science with a capital S, that then other ways of knowing get compared to. Or it also helps me to not have like two assumed truths, the Maasai way, the scientific way that I then compare, but rather to build a dialogue. So it's important for me to say, though, here that in doing this, it is not my intention to propose the Ingagwana as some kind of romanticized trope of Maasai indigeneity or an idyllic model of democratic decision-making. All knowledge production, of course, is shaped by and simultaneously enacts power dynamics, right? And so the Ingagwana is now different in that regard. I do believe, though, that, well, on the one hand, my use of it disrupts power dynamics as normal by choosing an indigenous format instead of a Western format to present findings. Also, I do believe that these three these three principles of the framework do make it so that power dynamics don't override the discussion. They don't take over. Structural power dynamics are not the only thing leading the discussion, and there seems to be a lot more room for debate and dialogue. And finally, I liked the Ingagwana because I do take seriously, and drawing here again from Donna Haraway, but also from Indigenous scholars, that how we tell stories about the world matters. So choosing an Indigenous format matters. Choosing a format that is truer to Maasai ways of sharing knowledge was important for me. So I actually do create Ingagwana as agenda items in the book, and I do this by bringing together Maasai participants, and these are all described in the book, my own scientific data collection, which just gets labeled as MG, so I just become another participant in the Ingagwana. The data and opinions of scientists, managers, conservationists, and conservation workers, working throughout Tanzania and Kenya. And I stay accountable by using citations and footnotes and explaining, if it's a true quote or whether it's a group interview or a bringing together of different ideas. And then I also bring to life the words of scientists as active speakers. And I do this with 3 agenda items. The first one, talking about where are the wildlife, seems like a simple question, but really it's incredibly complicated. to try and track wildlife presence in the landscape across time and space. And so I use this as a way to compare and contrast different ways of knowing where wildlife are, and also getting into some of the conflicts that happen when we think we're talking about the same thing, for instance, seasons, and we're in fact not. The second Ingiguana chapter is managing the range for wildlife and livestock. And here I really take an opportunity to tease apart the assumed boundaries between wild and domestic in terms of managing rangelands. And then the final one is an exploration of whether or not conservation corridors are a useful way of protecting wildlife in the humanized landscape. And what I'm going to do now is actually read from a part of the book that is from the second agenda item, managing the range for wildlife and livestock. And I'm going to do my best to read slowly. Please just flag me, Layla, if I'm sort of going too fast or not speaking clearly enough. The setting. The gathering for today's Ingiguana is the dry riverbed, Corongo, under the shade of an old ficus tree. The preferred location for an Ingiguana in Old Akai is under the large baobab, Almacera, which is actually this. I didn't have a picture of the ficus tree. That stands at the administrative center of the village, near the school and the new village office. But it is now the end of a long dry season, with most trees bare. Shade is hard to come by. The large ficus tree, nestled among smaller trees and tall grass along the walls of the Corongo, provides a rare escape from the hot October sun. Men flank both sides of the riverbed, several crammed up on limited space provided by the roots of the trees, many outstretched leisurely on the sloping walls of the Corongo, others squatting on rocks they gathered for this purpose on the Corongo floor. Women gather as a group in the tall grass at the very top of the Corongo, out of the direct sight of the men. There are no chairs nearby that can be brought in for the guests, who either sit amongst the Maasai or lean against their cars, parked where the road passes through the Corongo floor. Since this particular meeting concerns a government decision, the granting of a contract to a tour company and planning for dam construction for the village, it is chaired by the village chairman. And actually this meeting, it's actually an official meeting that happened, but then I utilize some original transcript from the meeting, but then I intersperse it with and change the meeting towards the end with other contributions. But before the chairman starts the meeting, as all meetings, it started with a blessing by the oldest elder present. He stands in the Corongo floor, which is the center of the meeting site, and will act as a speaking stage for those who will address the crowd. He blesses all of those present for rain, health, and fertility, but particularly for rain, for the cattle to survive until the rain arrives. The meeting is then opened by the village chairman, who starts with an overview of what was discussed last time and what needs to be discussed today, namely the dam. And so after some discussion about that, I'm going to just jump right into the contributions of a speaker. So what I do in the text is I use age set names that are defined early on in the book so that they explain to you where within the society this particular individual resides. And then I use pseudonym initials. And then I use stage directions to explain some of the power dynamics. Landis T. A healthy and strong man, he is well respected and trusted by most villagers. He is not around much these days as he works as a game scout in the Manura Ranch. He is very smart and very diplomatic. He stands and speaks with confidence. I have an issue to raise that I think we need to discuss. This dam to be built, won't it be used by wildlife? You all know that as well as I do, that if there's water here, all the wildlife will come. They will all come from the Manura Ranch. And what will happen when wildlife fill this space? What will we talk about then? I'm very thankful to our guests for the help they bring. It is good for us to have this dam, but we need to talk with the Manura Ranch so that they know that the wildlife will come to this area. And if they come to eat the grass, when the grass finishes, what will the cattle eat? Will we be able to negotiate use of the Manura Ranch for grazing? These are all very important questions that we should discuss before agreeing on anything officially. And then others stand up to talk about this, various age sets and various positions. Others are getting angry, particularly the village chairman and the foreigner who wants to just have the contract signed so that he can go on. Maka SI, An easygoing and well-liked man, he is often at odds with the village government as he is not afraid to say what he thinks. He is poor, and has no position of authority, but is trusted and respected for his intelligence and honesty. What Landis T says is very true. In a short while, in the future, there will be nothing left for the cattle. The area will get full of wildlife and they will finish the grass and make the ground bare. This is not a light matter, and we have not yet had enough discussion about this. We need to discuss this more. We discussed these issues when we were looking for the best place to put the dam, not in a grazing area, as the grass will quickly be finished by cattle and wildlife, especially wildebeest. They are particularly damaging. They will finish all the grass. Sounds of agreement, usho, uho from the men and women around the circle, attesting to how the wildebeest will finish the grass. Others stand and speak, including the tour operator working to get his contract signed so that he can go. But then some women start talking loudly amongst themselves, and they are called on by the chairman to speak. One, Yayo Y, does so quickly and quietly. We agree that the dam be built where proposed. There are places for the dam that we know the elders were discussing that were no good because the water there is salty. She trails off and is quiet while other women whisper to her. An elder begins to stand up to speak, and just then she continues to speak, seated, loudly this time. All this talk about wildlife is fine, but like Landis M said, even if the village is full of wildlife, won't it be better to have water? We say yes. She says this last word with extra emphasis, and the other women laugh. We struggle to find water here every day to drink and cook with. Don't give up this dam. Coco B. As the elders try to speak, another woman speaks up in a loud, coarse voice, weathered with age. It is true, when this dam is built, the animals will come, all of them. Using her hand, she gestures in a coming motion. The whole area will be full of wildlife. They will all come. Oh, and these animals will be very happy because this was their area. It is the open plains. They like it here. They will be happy because they will get water and they won't be thirsty again. And the people too, all those Maasai that moved to look for water, they will come back together with the wildebeest. The women all laugh. Peter, the micro enterprise development specialist for the African Wildlife Foundation, which is running the Manyara Ranch, saunters into the center of the meeting for where he has been leaning on his car. He turns and looks at everyone before speaking in a very authoritative tone. Do you want the dam or not? It sounds like you want it, but then only if you can get something in return. You just want access to the ranch, and now you see an opportunity to pull your arguments just so as to gain access. The Manyara Ranch is an island. You need to use the land within its capacity and not have more animals than the land can take. The rest of this area is all overgrazed. So is it possible for you to access the ranch if wildlife use of village lands increase? I'd have to say yes and no. Yes, if you learn to keep livestock in a sustainable way. What you do now is not sustainable. It is not a good match of livestock numbers with the resource base. So no, you should not be able to graze in the Manyara Ranch. Or 5 years from now, the ranch will look like it does here, where there's no grass. He looks around and swings his arm at the nearly bare short grass plains behind him. There's a great deal of commotion in the crowd until a highly respected elder stands to speak. Saori K, chuckling to himself, he puts on a serious face as he addresses his words at Mr. Peter in particular. That is what we call Alpura ala Manyani. I have lived in this area all my life and it has always looked like that. Even before they drew this boundary for the ranch, it was like this. You see, Alpura means a place that is bare and no grass grows. And ala Manyani refers to a different kind of soil. Ala Manyani is a place that above it has grass, but if you dig about a foot below, you will get salt, which causes all these changes in the grass. But because it is not there, it is not just there that is called ala Manyani. Grass grows in some of these places. All over the village, we have different areas of ala Manyani, but it is short grass that finishes fast. And in other places, herbs grow, which also finish fast, which is why this area is bare now. It is the end of a long dry season. He pauses, looking around at the dusty landscape. It is complex. There are different types of ala Manyani. Of course, there are also impacts from grazing. If cattle are many in one area, they can finish the grass until it changes and herbs come to dominate. Even trees will increase because you can't burn since there is no grass to burn, so the trees will continue to grow. But there is no place in these villages where I have seen this happen. Game Scout 1, who is Maasai. A young man, he saunters onto the stage. I am sure what the elder said is true. He knows this land better than I do. But I understand what Peter is saying, and I know that it is something that is hard for Maasai to see. It is not that cattle from the villages will finish the grass in the ranch, but they will ruin the environment because they will all come in on one path. More than 11,000 cattle from a Suale that will bring a korongo, create gully erosion. And then no grass will grow again. I have learned this in Mwanza, where I studied wildlife conservation. Also, if cattle eat all in one place, they can finish the grass until it is taken by the wind and the land becomes tired. Wind erosion. Maasai don't see this, and they don't take into account the difference between now and long ago. If we want to conserve the environment and wildlife, we need to get rid of some cattle. People start to make noise, upset with what he is saying. An elder from his boma, the owner of all the cattle, tells him to sit down and stands up to speak. This is an elder. He's one of the most respected and powerful elders in the area, and by far the wealthiest. Despite the respect, he knows a man. He speaks in a gentle, melodic tone. Youth these days, they forget what the elders taught them and brag about what they've learned in school. It is good for them to study, to learn how to gain from the wildlife, to gain milk from the wildlife like we do from cattle. But if they spent more time at home, they would know that cattle can't ruin the environment by finishing the grass, not if it rains. But he was correct in talking about the damaging effects of pathways where grass cannot grow because cattle walk there every day. But next to the path, grass will grow as usual. But we have rules about where cattle can go at different times to prevent this. And we have pasture reserves, a la Lily. And we can tell our sons, do not take cattle to that place again today. You will finish the grass. So he chuckles, yes, sometimes I guess cattle can finish the grass. And then sometimes when it rains, herbs will grow instead of grass. And then the cows don't get enough to eat. But an area can fluctuate between grass and herbs depending on the rains. It is really the rainfall that determines these things. But it is not just cattle that can finish grass. Even wildlife can finish grass. They're all animals. Wildebeest really ruin an area because wildebeest don't leave until they finish the grass completely, leaving only dust behind.
Mara, could we move on to the big questions to finish just because we're running out of time?
Sure. So I'm just gonna, thanks, Layla. I'm just gonna say after that, there is some discussion about wildlife being scared by cattle. And then this is just to show you that somebody stands up to speak with the data showing that in fact, where we see wildlife and where we see livestock, but also saying that even though it's not captured on the scientific data, that there are wildlife all around the bomas at night. So around Maasai homesteads at night where they seek protection from lions. And then I end this section with an elder who talks about the need, again, just repeating this need for all animals to be seen as being one. So that grass is put forth for wildlife and livestock. So I guess in the end then, to loop it back in, the big question is, what does this have to do with decolonizing conservation, right? Well, I think that it still remains unclear what it might really look like to decolonize conservation. There's a lot more work going on in Canada, I think, than anywhere else in the world in a lot of ways. But I would say that it needs to start with changing the boundaries, how boundaries are drawn and how conservation is talked about and thought about in the models that are used. And so the contribution to the conversation that I think that the book makes are the following. One is epistemologically, it decenters Western scientific knowledge and Western narrative formats and versions of truth by using the Ingiguana, by using Maasai place names, by using different versions of Maasai narratives. Ontologically, it opens up space for taking seriously Indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world, but without freezing Indigenous people as something singular, or Maasai in this case as a singular group. Materially, it challenges mainstream conservation's core tenet of the need to separate people from nature and continuing to sort of draw and police boundaries to do that. And thereby it opens up possibilities for really doing conservation differently in ways that build on relations rather than on separations. But I want to just really push the idea that this is really just the beginning and this is just one approach. And then I'm interested in learning and having conversations with many of you, with Indigenous communities and people working with Indigenous communities around the world, across borders, academic, sectoral, national, and really sort of push the point that particularly now as we think about the new biodiversity development and biodiversity conservation planning, that it's really not just about having Indigenous people come to the table or contributing to the dialogue, but rather shaping the dialogue and shaping how the dialogue is constructed and how we have conversations. And that this is incredibly important now because of that planning and also because of the ongoing acts of colonial conservation around the world. And I will end on that and open it up for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mara. And so I will just encourage those of you who are able to put on your camera, if you don't mind. That would be great to have some more people be visible. And there's some taps if you can't see them, Mara. I know there's a question from Peter. I think we're going to stick with our typical practice and see if we have one or two student questions first to start us off. And then Peter, if you want to mention your question, we can go to you, or I could read it for you, whatever you prefer.
And sorry for going over. I didn't see the chat.
It's okay. I thought you didn't see it. That's why I spoke up. So let's go ahead with a couple student questions to start us off, please.
I'm going to unshare.
Go ahead, Leah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed the reading. I'm almost sad you didn't get to finish it. But I'm wondering if they did reach a consensus about the dam. What was the end of that meeting?
Leila, how do you want me to do this? Just answer as we go, or?
Sure, let's go ahead and then maybe we'll take a couple at once if there's a lot more questions towards the end, but go ahead and respond to that. And we'll see if someone else puts their hand up in the meantime.
So the consensus for the meeting itself was, yeah, they took the dam and there wasn't really any negotiation or dealing with the issue of livestock grazing or wildlife grazing and livestock grazing in the ranch. The end of the meeting though, what I end up doing in the chapter is like, again, expanding it much further than just that question. And so then the consensus ends up being a larger, sort of more wishful discussion of having to rethink about the entire area more holistically, like what would happen if grazing plans included the ranch and village lands, and then it would enable a better management practice. But in terms of the dam, it was a very small dam and it didn't really have much impact in the end. But yeah, thanks.
Anyone else wishing to ask a question? Go ahead, Josephine.
Hi, thank you for this great presentation. I'm curious, so going back to one of the first examples you mentioned where you had this protected area and the Maasai were still using it for grazing, and there was some grazing there was regulated and they were using it in a slightly different way. I'm curious to know what were the sort of biggest, what was communication between conservation practitioners or regulators and Maasai around that issue? Like I'm wondering whether the sort of the big gap here was an absence of communication, or if there was communication and it was these misaligned goals, or a completely different approach to conservation. And I'm assuming it's a mix of things that are related to the approach that you're suggesting here towards the end. But I'm sort of curious to know what communication looked like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, well, overall, in most protected areas, there's no grazing allowed. Even in Masai Mara Game Reserve, which is run by Maasai, there's no grazing officially allowed. The Manure Ranch, it was part of the initial bargain, but it was very much regulated in a way that didn't really fit Maasai ways of regulating cattle. For starters, it was counting. I did participate in all the meetings that were held at the ranch, and that was one of the reasons why I came up with this idea of the need to improve participation, because the communication was very top down, all the while with the assumption that there was participation, because there were representatives and the representatives were there and they would ask what their feedback was, but it was always done in a way that was very constricted because it was based on, I say, Western format. The manager, who was originally British, said that it was more like the Tanzanian format, but it was this very formalized system that didn't really leave them much space. to contribute, and not until they got really angry and then would speak out. And so they basically would agree to things because they didn't think they had the right to disagree, and then they would just break the rules.
So let's go to Maddie, then
Thank
Peter,
you.
then Kai, please.
Thank you so much for this, and I really appreciate the complexity with which you were dealing with these different voices and different perspectives from within the kind of the community side of things. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about kind of the nature of political dynamics in this type of meeting that you've explained, and who you talked about kind of everyone having space to talk and everyone having space to be heard, but obviously in many communities around the world that kind of is, that idea is constructed around certain identities and dynamics. And so I'm interested in hearing you speak a little bit more to the kind of internal dynamics that shape how those conversations and consensus type outcomes emerge.
Yeah, that's thanks, Maddie. That's a really great question and a super important one, and it's one I always expect to get. And I'm always because I don't mean to romanticize it as if those dynamics don't exist. Of course they exist, and of course they're there. And the way that they work differs in different areas. I did my dissertation work in one particular Maasai section and group, and then I went and traveled and observed through my postdoc lots of other places and realized that things were a bit different in different places, which was very useful. But so the dynamics work in, for one, women sit and men stand when they speak. But there's also ways in which, women will work amongst, I try to kind of get at that, like certain women are never afraid to speak or have the ability to speak more than others, but they don't necessarily always know what's happening. So other women will whisper to them about what to say. And you find the same kind of side conversations happening amongst men. What I did find was that like the kind of looking only for power dynamics, put on blinders, looking for very specific structural power dynamics that didn't often hid other dynamics that were occurring. I would find, for instance, that somebody would speak at length and everybody would listen. And afterwards I would ask people like, why was everybody listening? He's poor. He has no position of authority. He's not like none of the structural dynamics that I knew that gave somebody power would have given him that kind of power. And he was just a good orator. And so that kind of trumped everything else. Sometimes it's about sort of inside negotiations. So it's not perfect, but I think there's a lot more wiggle room and a lot more micro power dynamics at play that take knowing the language, knowing the community even more than I was able to. Sometimes my assistants would pick up things that I didn't pick up. I saw things that were different, but then also having space for it to be always kind of negotiable, I think.
Thank you so much.
Can we go to your question and then we'll go to Kai?
Sure. Hi, Mara. Nice to see you here. Too bad we didn't get to you physically, but maybe later. I guess my question, Mara, when I saw the map of the Maasai land as you showed it, it was interesting because you know that I used to live with the Wakuria on the other side of Serengeti. And the Wakuria had a very different opinion, as did the Wasukuma, the Waikoma, and the Bearbag, and the Watindiga, matter of fact, about the role of the Maasai in the area and their ownership of the land. The story I remember was that, according to them, their land was expropriated from the Maasai 200 years ago, and they've been in a war ever since. And I was there, when many people were killed around me over that war. And so I just wonder, how do you deal with those complex dynamics when you have multiple groups who feel strongly that not only the wildlife, but the land and resources there are theirs? And there's historical there. And, the Watindiga would be a good group in Tanzania to think about an underclass First Nations that has been, thrown off their land, in this case, by the historical interactions of other groups moving in. So how do you deal with that complexity?
That's a great question. Not the one I was expecting, though, from the ecologist, I must say. And yeah, I don't know if you could tell, like when I talk about it, when I present, I sort of, I'm cautious, or I tried to be cautious, like this area historically sort of claimed by, but obviously, other people living there, Maasai being the dominant tribe, is sort of the way that I frame it. And I'm really kind of following their lead in the sense of, they are at this point, they were the ones that signed off to Serengeti and got the rights to Ngorongoro, and obviously some others didn't. Some of the Datoga, part of the Bearbeg, did as well. And there are groups. So a group that I work with in Tanzania called Pingos is, and UCRT, both groups that work on indigenous rights don't work only with Maasai, but they work as well with the Barabeg and the Hadzabe in particular, and overlapping areas, and many of the same kinds of questions, being able to figure out how to manage land that they are calling theirs today as in terms of a village land. And so from the places that I worked in, the villages were specifically, they were Maasai. That's legally, you're not allowed to call a village by an ethnic group in Tanzania, but all the other people that lived there that were not necessarily, were basically migrant workers or married in, and there were politics that I think are fascinating and interesting, but there weren't land clashes there based on tribe. It's different further north in Loliondo, for instance, in the north, and then in the areas that you're talking about historically. And so I think it's important to always be aware of those complexities. Inside Maasai areas too, I mentioned on one of the slides that there are different sections that I get into in more detail in the book, but I didn't today in the talk. I mean, in the Loliondo area, there are Maasai of different sections that end up fighting against each other. In other parts of Tanzania and in Kenya, there are different clans. And so it's not one cohesive group, even within Maasai communities. And so it's important to sort of recognize those. And I don't think basically what I'm suggesting as a method is to have an open dialogue and let everybody have a seat at the table. And so I don't think it's necessarily promotes a Maasai way of having to do things. The Ngagwana is a meeting that they have that I'm familiar with. And if I was to, I know that the Barabeg have something quite similar. When I was working with UCRT, they were also working on building up some of their leadership. And so I think if it would be in places where there was more diversity, it would be about trying to figure out if there were other forms of communication that needed to be respected and brought in. But the model that I propose is just one that I think creates more space for diversity, regardless of where that diversity is coming from, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Mara. Let's go to Kai. And then if someone else has a question in the wings, go ahead and raise your hand, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was really, really interesting and just fun, as Leah said. We've been thinking a lot about how to integrate traditional indigenous knowledge along with science, and I hadn't heard of this approach before, and I think it's got a lot going for it. But one concern that I'd have that I'd love to hear you talk through is just the way that formats like this kind of, they decentralize science in a way that as a scientist I find a little concerning, right? That we're, in a sense, that the kind of the legitimacy of a given piece of evidence and its associated methodology and analysis is reduced, in a sense, to how well it's taken up and re-articulated, by those who are in the meeting, right? Subject to the limitations associated with their stature and their power in all those other dimensions and their oratory skills, right? And so I just wonder if you can just speak to that. Like, what do you propose a way to address that? Like, and I definitely don't have an answer here, right, as to what is a good way to address this, but it's just like, it strikes me as a really central tension where the whole point of science is that it shouldn't be subject to limitations based on, based on the person who's representing it. Now, I don't also want to claim that even in scientific meetings, there is that kind of very idealized representation. But anyway, I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, that's a really big one. I think, so part of what, okay, I'm going to try and take this one step at a time. Part of what I was really interested in doing, and it goes all the way back to like when I was a graduate student and really frustrated with ideas of integrating indigenous knowledge into science. Seems a bit wrong to me. Also, there were all the sort of ethnosciences were all about comparing something that was considered true and everything else on that sort of up to that scale, right? And so And you see this, for instance, in taxonomy. And I was thinking, well, what happened? Like, they'll say, oh, but indigenous people also can break down the animals into these categories. What happens if you started flat? Not that, I mean, obviously there's power, so it's not flat, but rather like if you started your field work, instead of saying, well, do you, representing what you consider a true breakdown of the world along scientific taxonomic groups, and then asked how indigenous knowledge fit into that, you just asked, well, how do you divide the world? Right. And so I did that with Maasai, and the first division was not wild and domestic. Cattle, and then there was flexibility. Cattle were sometimes wild and sometimes domestic. And so that's not exactly answering your question. I'm getting there though.
Yeah, just to refine, I'm not as, I think that those kinds of questions, there's no, there's no one right truth, right? And in many cases there's not, but on questions of causality, right? Like what's going to happen if the wildlife come, are they going to have the same kind of influence as cattle, right? Like those, I think those questions are a bit different than like, how do you divide up the world? How do you classify living organisms?
Well, this is, I would actually disagree. And I think that's those questions are really almost more where the positionality really does matter. And so we had conversations, for instance, where we would say, if you were a scientist and you were driving your car and you're counting animals, for instance, and then where are the wildlife, right? If you're an ecologist and you're doing road transects, you're limited by the road, you're limited by the vehicle, you're limited by your own vision. And a scientist and ecologist would agree that that transect is going to produce certain outputs, which are going to be different than if they did a walking transect, which are going to be different than if they did a flying transect, right?
Yeah,
but a Maasai would
no
add
debate
to
here
that.
on that.
Right.
Of course, positionality matters.
But Maasai would then add to that like the zebra, if it would be different if you were Maasai because of the clothing that you wear and because of the scent that you have, but also that the zebra have a particular personality and wildebeest have a particular personality, and that would impact the ways in which you can see them or hear them in different ways. And so I think that so the reason I went to the taxonomy question was what I was looking for was a way to figure out what would happen if we actually treated scientific truths and indigenous truths sort of with the same degree of exploration and questioning, right? And so this was important for me, for instance, when I got to questions of, okay, well, where do the wildebeest go? Because and I had Maasai tell me, well, they're always over here at this time of year. And then I said, well, how come I haven't seen them yet? They're not here, right? And their information was wrong, right? It just didn't pan out. And they would start to think, and then they would have all kinds of, you talk about causality. Okay, well, actually, yeah, the rains haven't come. There are all these different reasons that might have impacted why they weren't doing what they always do, according to Maasai. Scientists would do the same thing. And they would have, but they had, just like the Maasai would talk about what the elders had taught them. All the ecologists all went back to this one report that was written by Hugh Lamprey in 1964. And he did it was very good research. He had massive, it was a colony at the time, so massive labor to just go out and do these transects. And he found that the wildlife were moving all over the place, created this really beautiful map with these arrows of mobility that has been used as the baseline ever since. And so you go and you ask an ecologist, well, where do the wildebeest go at this time of year? Well, they always go there, because that's just what he knows, because he read the scientific report. Now, why is that different than what the Maasai say from hearing what the elders tell them? And then I had to question them, well, why are they not there now? And then what can we use to kind of probe deeper? And why can't we do that probing with Maasai and with scientists, right? Into their methods, into their positionality, into the temporality, into the changes, right? And so that's what I was trying to get at with presenting that different information at the meetings. Because then what you have is like, you have the presentation of data. So in the counting where the wildlife are chapter, I have these scientists, these young scientists who did this really great, all these different methods to count the wildlife presence. And their work is seen as kind of really sort of the best work in the area right now. And so, but there were obviously flaws, because there's always flaws in counting methodologies. And so then the Maasai start picking it apart, like, well, that's not even, you say they're not there in the dry season, and we say they are there in the dry season because it's not the dry season. It's this in-between season when there's still some water, but there's no grass. And so it just kind of it forces a deeper discussion. It doesn't say that the data is wrong or bad, or that it just says, it kind of teases it out, and I think really helps to pull apart the complexity that's important. And unfortunately, a lot of these, we're always looking for sort of discrete answers in the wildlife ecology. I mean, we're not in some of the deeper behavioral stuff, but in the where are they? This season they go here, this season they do this. Season is, a long months. And so once you kind of put it into conversation and you enable lots of different contributions, then it helps, I think, for more complexity to come through. Does that?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a great start. I hope you come and that we can talk about this at length later. But yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
It reminds me of the questions put to Bruno Latour too about the science wars, and now we have the vaccine wars, and how do you think about social understandings of science, but also take seriously some of those issues. So we'll go last question to Ayumi, please, and then we'll close. Let's try to keep the question. Let's keep the question and the answer brief if we can, just for time. Thanks.
Sorry. Okay, so I guess when you make the conservation planning, I guess after you learn about the indigenous knowledge, maybe you must translate this knowledge back to the Western knowledge again. So are there any suggestions how to do it effectively?
I guess, are you talking about like translation from a language perspective, or just from a like a knowledge, like into a sort of scientific format kind of?
Yes, not just the language, but the format. Like, for example, you use the mapping system. So like this. So in order to back again to the Western knowledge, so yeah, the way to the context.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think translation is huge and important to not take lightly. And I try not to do any direct translations. And so I have Maasai seasons. We have a table that I created that says it's sometimes between this month and sometimes between that month, and then give specifics for the months that they fell across while I was there. And then with a whole lengthy description about how they're mobile and you can't always make them fit into those boxes. And so it's about avoiding discrete direct translations, but rather having it be fluid. You need some translation to make it work. But I don't think the translation should always be one direction. It shouldn't always be indigenous knowledge becomes legible. For science, I think sometimes scientists should be made to feel uncomfortable by having to read Maasai names on maps and not the other way around. That makes sense.
Thanks so much, Mara, and thanks everyone for coming. So as mentioned, we hope that we'll have a longer discussion over a half day or so in the coming months. So if that's particularly of interest, there are several people in the room, Maggie Lowe, myself, Jessica Dempsey, and others who will be doing that. So be in touch if you'd be interested in being part of some larger conversations open up by Mara's work in the book, and that I think she's looking forward to hearing some other thoughts and ideas, especially Indigenous scholars and others working with communities here. So thanks everyone. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you so much, Leila. And